watching Captains of Industry here on CNBC Africa, and I'm speaking to Mark Lamberti, the CEO of Imperial. Mark, thanks very much for your time. You dropped out of university to start a rock band. That's where we're going to start this interview. Give me a little colour.
Well, I'd played music at home. My mother was a musician, and I loved music, but a realization came to me in my second year of a BSc that was not what I wanted, and I wanted to do the things that I wanted to do. And so I went off, played in a rock band for 4 years as a professional musician.
How did your parents respond? Because it was your father's dream for you to become an engineer.
Yes. Initially not well, but over time they came to recognize that each of us has to follow his or her own star.
What was the name of the rock band?
It was a band called the Gate Show Band.
The Gate Show Band.
Yeah.
4 years. Then you got married and
Right.
you decided you had to get a real job.
Right.
What was that real job?
Went back home to my father, and he and his brother had put up shopping centres in northern Natal in Newcastle, and got involved in a little store selling home appliances, TVs, hi-fis and so on, because I knew a bit about sound. But pretty soon realized that I wanted something bigger and more intellectually challenging than a small business where, as I'm sure you know, in a small business you're everything. You're the salesman, the delivery man, and so on and so on. And so decided if I wanted to learn about big business, I better get into a big business.
And that's where Bradlow's came into
Correct.
the picture. 640 Rand a month, if
Yes.
I'm correct.
Yes.
You learned everything
The branch
then?
manager of Bradlow's Ladysmith, yes, that's where it started. And moved up that organization until I was responsible for everything in that organization other than finance.
So you worked your way up at Bradlow's. Then what happened?
Then I was approached by Mervyn King and Nady Kirsch to join what was then called Trade Grow, and to help them with two very vibrant entrepreneurs who were running a little business called Jazz Stores. And I worked with them, and that was the first business that I took public.
Then fast track me to 1990, the founder of Massmart, and basically that was seeded by 6 macro stores.
Correct.
1990 you listed.
1988 I moved across to, I was attracted by the Wooltrue Group to go across and take over these 6 macro stores, which we formulated the strategy, and by 2000 we took it public. So from 88 until 2000 it was developing a business, a fairly high compound rate of growth, but towards the end of the 90s Wooltrue started to unbundle, and Massmart was listed at that time. 12 Rand 50 on July the 4th 2000. That was the listing price of Bradlow's.
12 Rand 50 on July the 4th?
2000.
2000. What made you recognized in the industry at that stage? Before the Wooltrue Group approached you, how had you solidified your reputation in the retail environment?
Well, the Wooltrue Group actually approached me on the basis of a talk that I delivered to the Human Resource Institute about a rather unconventional way that we were dealing with people in Jazz stores. And that provoked an approach from Wooltrue. Their first approach was that I went to run Truworths, but strange as it may sound, Annette and I didn't want to live in Cape Town, and I said no. And they came back a few months later and said, well, what about macro?
Of course, I've got to ask you about the unconventional approach to people. What was that all about?
People down the line in an organization have hidden talent, and that by recognizing their differences, recognizing their leadership skills, one can unleash power. My particular approach was to say it's much easier to take a natural leader and turn that person into a shopkeeper than to take a shopkeeper and try and teach them to be a leader. So I looked for leaders among the unionists and anybody who exhibited some ability to get others to follow.
You live by a personal mission statement, and I believe it's in your briefcase. So I'm not going to. How much can you divulge of your personal mission statement? I know that you have, empowered your family with it, the people that you've worked with in leadership, in close leadership quarters with.
Yes, I can divulge it totally. The basis of it. A mission statement is not something that you want to do or what you want to have. A mission statement is who you want to be. And so following a period of kind of philosophical introspection, I wrote this and then gave it to people that I live with and I work with the request that if I kind of violate my own principles, just remind me, because none of us are perfect. In essence, what I believe is that my life is a journey of discovering who I am. To this day, I don't know who the full, authentic Mark Lamberti is, and I try and do things in every aspect of my life to try and discover that. It's a little like when Michelangelo was asked how he created David. He said, "I just got rid of the parts I didn't want."
Mark, entrepreneurs have challenges, this we know. How did you deal with the stormy times that you refer to?
I think virtually every entrepreneur that I know has gone through a period where they've had to dig really deep, stare into the abyss and say, "This is me and nobody else can get me out of that." I had that particular experience when on paper it seemed like a very good idea to merge Dion and Macro. The businesses had about a 70% product overlap, and so I thought putting them together would reduce costs and improve our buying power, and it did both of those things. But in the process, we lost control of the margin and we lost control of the inventory. Now, you can't do much worse in a retail business, and our profits went backwards.
Did you undo the transaction?
I had to, but that also concurred with a physical issue where I ended up having some issues with my back. And so both physically and in business, for the first time, I was almost staring into the abyss. And you look into that and you say, well, no one else is going to get us out of this. And you look for the best in you, and you gather the people around you, and you move forward.
As you say, life is a journey about self-discovery, and those parts that you don't like about yourself, you eliminate. What have you eliminated over time? Are there things that you can share with us?
Well, the thing that I'm clear about in my mission is that greed, emotion, and fatigue make me bad. Every time I've been influenced by greed or by emotion or by fatigue, I make lower quality decisions than I would otherwise, so I try and avoid those things.
Let's go back into the Massmart story. Very successful business. Enter Walmart, the global retail, or the US retail king. That must have been an interesting time for you in negotiating that transaction. Obviously, at the time, you had Grant Patterson at the helm as CEO.
Yes, I think it's important to say that it was probably one of the most deliberate strategic decisions we've ever made, or I've ever made in my career. We had decided way back that in building Massmart, we should build a business that was so good that an international player would think twice about coming in here, and secondly, would prefer to buy us rather than doing that. So my first visit to Bentonville happened in 1990. And we cultivated those relationships over a long, long period of time.
So this is not something that happened over a short period?
No, on the contrary. The transaction was absolutely Grant's. I mean, I was the chairman of the company at the time, and he must take credit for the actual deal. But the development of the relationship was something that was done over a long period of time, and in many, many respects, we molded ourselves on Walmart. I mean, Walmart was a general merchandise business that became the biggest food business in America. Massmart was the biggest general merchandise business on the continent, and we had a food component. And I think Walmart saw and continues to see the ability or a platform for them to become a big food player in Southern Africa and Africa.
For some time after the transaction, you were non-executive director of the group. You've obviously relinquished those responsibilities as you've now moved into the CEO role at Imperial. But before we move off the Massmart Walmart transaction, do you feel that the synergies, looking outside now in, do you feel that the synergies have been reaped?
I think it's inappropriate for me to comment on Massmart. When I was the CEO, I would answer any question. When I ceased to be, I left that to the management, and I think that you should ask those questions today of Guy.
Talk about transaction capital,
yes.
Because obviously in terms of timeline, Massmart, and then you founded Transaction Capital.
Well, not quite founded it. I was invited by the current partners who are, there were at the time 4 extraordinary men. One of them has gone on to do other things, but a partnership of 3 extraordinary people. One of them, Jonathan Jorna, probably one of the finest financial minds I've ever come across. And they invited me to join the partnership and to lead the group. What it was at the time was, one would call it a kind of a hands-on private equity financial services business. And so there was a lot of rationalization of assets, changing of people, and then we eventually took that public in 2012. At 8 Rand a share in June. There was a sale of assets not long after that, which resulted in a 2 Rand special dividend. And today the share is sitting at somewhere around about close to 11 Rand. So I think there's been a real nice creation of value. But once those two assets had been sold, it was a relatively small business, and I don't mean this arrogantly, but at the same time, David Hurwitz was a great successor and in the wings and able to take it forward. And at that time I stood down.
You talk about the success of the sale of Bayport, in that you managed to sell an unsecured lending business at 3 times the price you got it for before African Bank imploded. I mean, you make the comment that it's all about timing. That timing was impeccable.
Yes, and I can't take all the credit for that. Michael Mendelowitz, who is one of those partners, was very instrumental in that transaction. Also a very astute businessman. And I think we all saw the best way to realize value out of Bayport going forward.
From transaction capital, many would have thought Mark Lamberti now is going to sail into the sunset and reap the rewards of a very fruitful entrepreneurial career. You are one of the brightest and best in the country, given your history and what you've achieved. But you didn't. You decided to take on a new challenge for the 3rd time and become the CEO of Imperial. Take me through your thinking process as to why you've decided to go into this journey.
Well, you know, I don't know of anything that could be more satisfying than running a business, and particularly running a large business. I think that the intellectual challenges of complexity, the day-to-day interface with smart colleagues and counterparties, and the fact that when things are going well, there's huge satisfaction, and when things are going badly, you feel obligated to stay and fix them. You know, so there's a lot of things in running a business that appeal to me. And I also am puzzled by the notion of turning one's leisure time into a full-time activity. I mean, leisure is leisure because we work. So for example, I fly helicopters, and I can think of nothing more enjoyable than flying my helicopter for an hour or two on the weekend. That if you said to me, do this for 8 hours a day, it ceases to be pleasure. When the Imperial opportunity came along, my analysis was that I don't have the skills to run a manufacturing business. I don't have the skills to run a bank. I don't have the skills to run a mine. But the kind of skills I did have looked like being quite applicable to where Imperial was at that point in its history. And so I think there was a relatively good fit. And now 20 months in, I'm enjoying it. And
it's challenging. I mean,
yes.
You took over as CEO in March 2014.
Yes.
The Rand has completely gone the wrong way, and that obviously impacts your vehicle business because
Right.
you cannot pass on those price increases to the end consumer.
Correct.
That has impacted your half-year results, and as a result, your full year results will be below the prior year.
Yes.
Which is difficult, given that it's beyond your control.
Except for one thing, and this again may sound a little philosophical. For me, financial performance is always a lagging indicator. So I don't look to financial performance and get satisfaction in running a business. I look behind that to the operating performance, and I look behind that to the human performance. I've had many businesses where the bottom line was terrible, but I slept at night because I knew people were doing the right things, and it was only a matter of time before the bottom line came right. The converse is also true. I've had instances where businesses have been doing well, but I've been concerned because we're not doing the right things. Right now, my preoccupation is to bring to bear a strategy that takes Imperial from the level that it was left mainly by Bill Lynch and thereafter by Hubert Brody, and put a layer of strategic clarity on it and a layer of, let's call it, a younger, next generation leadership who can take that business forward 10 years from now. So I'm preoccupied with those things, and we'll look after the financials, obviously, but there's things to do in our strategy, getting rid of unfocused assets and non-aligned assets and underperforming assets, through that having a slightly bigger war chest to go and do big development outside of South Africa and take that 33% international presence of Imperial to more closer to 50.
The 33% international presence gives you a good sense of what is happening in different territories, so the Americas and obviously Europe. Germany has been slow to come to the fore from a recovery perspective. Do you see, and there are a lot of global experts out there at the moment saying that they see subdued global growth going forward for the foreseeable future. I mean, foreseeable future could be 10 years out. Do you have the same sense, and are you going to right-size Imperial to cope with a different growth scenario?
Well, right size normally means reducing the size of the organization. I believe that in these times there are going to be opportunities to acquire similar and adjacent businesses to our logistics business in Europe and Africa. And drive that, if you like, that transformation of Imperial from a mainly South African logistics and motor business into a mainly international logistics business.
So what would you see the split? When you say mainly international, you want over 50% in the international,
well,
on the international stage?
Yes, our logistics business is already 2/3 international. If you put together our European business, you mentioned America, but that's very small. Our European business essentially and our rest of Africa business, that is 2/3 of the total logistics business. So with regard to logistics, we are moving in the right direction. With regard to the group, I have to stress that the reason for not wanting to be in South Africa has got everything to do with market shares and not that much to do with the current state of the South African economy. We are by far the largest business in motor vehicles in the country, in motor vehicle distribution and retailing, and we are the largest business in logistics, and therefore
your growth is limited in this space.
Exactly, yeah.
So international, Europe will be a target arena, and you're looking for acquisitions.
More than Europe, maybe EMEA. We look at other things as well. So, but certainly in logistics is going to be the drive.
How much of your time do you spend on a plane at the moment?
This year I've probably spent about 60 nights away from home, so you've got to move.
And from a balance perspective, we always take the opportunity to ask CEOs about balance. You've mentioned Annette repeatedly during the conversation, so she's obviously integral to your well-being and to your life. Does your wife travel with you?
Occasionally, but it's not a lot of fun sitting in a hotel room when one's spouse is working. So there's not much fun in that. If I stay over weekends, sometimes she does. But I think the issue of balance is really about how one defines oneself. It's not about the allocation of hours. It means that, if you are a spouse, when it comes time to be a spouse, you better be there.
Let's talk about executive remuneration and your stance, particularly in the Imperial fold. When you came in as CEO, you decided not to take a salary. Rather, you wanted that salary allocated to an education fund, scholarship, to empower people that were earning less than 600,000 Rand in the organization to allow their children to go to university and to enjoy the benefits of broader education. Why did you decide to do this?
The reason was that I wanted to be unequivocal in the fact that my only interest was long-term shareholder interest. So I didn't want to be taking a job, as it were, and I invested some money of my own in the company, and all of my compensation is related to the long term. The board's response was, well, then we're overstating the profits of the company because we're not paying you a salary. And I said, well, then let's take that money and give it to something worthy. All of my family foundation's efforts have been directed at education, and particularly tertiary education. And so we did that. So we have the next generation bursary scheme now operating in Imperial for the children, for the tertiary education of children who are our employees' children.
The long-term aspect of this business and your investment in Imperial, the fact that you own an enormous tranche of shares, has that given a sense of comfort? You've obviously done road shows, and generally potential shareholders will celebrate skin in the game from the CEO, so to speak. It must have been well received.
It was, but let me hasten to add that, and again, this may sound strange, but my entire motivation in Imperial is intrinsic. For me, the joy and the satisfaction of doing what has to be done in Imperial, and hopefully we'll get it right in the next few years, is what it's about. The money is important, but a little bit more or a little bit less is not going to change the way I behave.
So it goes back to that element of greed. Eliminate the greed issue and you're on the right path. So your vision for the group now. You've got your personal mission, which you've shared with us. Where do you want, you mentioned the next couple of years, so can you define the vision for Imperial?
As we sit here today, we've already in recent months announced 2 relatively large disposals. Those should realize, once they're approved by the necessary authorities, those will realize about 3 billion. I believe that we've got another 2 billion of disposals to go. So that 5 billion together with our borrowing capacity gives us the ability to do a transaction of the order of 10 billion, which can be dial moving in a business with a current market capitalization of around 35 billion and sales of just over 110 billion and profits of about 6. So taking that war chest and applying it to international growth, preferably off the continent, is going to be good, and that's a work in progress. The second piece of work that's very successfully in progress is the growth into Africa. We have built almost 11 billion rand business in Africa in 10 years. And so that's been very fast growth. We're growing there at over the 50% of revenue and profits. And the third piece of the growth, of course, is to get Europe steady and with acquisitions integrated and restructured. So it's kind of a 3-pronged strategy directed at what I described earlier.
What type of person do you surround yourself with when it comes to the work environment?
I really believe in diversity. I've just appointed 2 women to the executive committee. The people who report directly to me in our office, I hate to use the language, but would be classified as previously disadvantaged people. And I believe in diversity in a general sense, not in a political sense, because I think different people bring different ideas to bear. The entry ticket to the game is at the level that we deal in, they have to have intellectual horsepower. And that doesn't necessarily mean qualifications, but it sometimes does. And so I like to think that the people that report directly to me today are a very interesting combination of education, experience, and just raw intellect who understand their businesses. And I don't believe that one could run a business the size of Imperial without that.
What advice would you share with fellow entrepreneurs who are starting out, who look up to you and say, Mark Lamberti is the ultimate when it comes to being an entrepreneur, and I want to be exactly like Mark Lamberti? What would you say to them?
I'd say that's probably the biggest mistake you could ever make, because I think trying to be exactly the same as someone else is a waste of time. But in terms of kind of lessons, I would again revert to some quite philosophical views. The first is that there's no such thing as, let's call it, bulletproof wealth built quickly. That doesn't happen. And I think it takes a lifetime to build the kind of position, entrepreneurial awareness exemplified by the kind of people I looked up to in this country. The other thing that I think is quite important, and very, very difficult to say this to a 35-year-old, but the most important things in life cannot be measured and they cannot be bought. And it's a perspective that we sometimes lose.
Give me a sense of what your peer group in business leadership is sharing at the moment in what we are facing, and let's be honest about it, this is a difficult environment in South Africa.
Yes, I think one of the issues that we face is that business is not homogeneous and different business people have different perspectives. I happen to believe at the moment that South Africa is entering a period of structural change, and this is not cyclical. What we're going through now is not just another cycle, and there are a number of reasons that we could talk about for that. For a long time, there has been a big constituency with a voice, and that has been organized labor. In the last few weeks, we've seen 2 other very big constituencies emerge, the students and the EFF. I happen to think that EFF march to Sandton the other day was very, very orderly. And secondly, I think that the demands that they made, and I have the letter as forwarded to us by Nikki Newton-King, 17 of those demands, of the 17 demands, 12 of them are already met by Imperial. 3 of them, I think, are not applicable because of our industry and for no other reason. And the others, I think we could probably meet partially. Now, if somebody's coming to the table with that kind of debate, we as business can't stand aloof of it. And in fact, I'd go further and say if you've got those three big constituencies shaping the national debate, it's a travesty if business is not part of that debate. We have to bring intellectual leadership to it, or at least an intellectual contribution in as much as we can. And I don't think that we're doing that today. I don't think that we are speaking up in the fora that we should. There's a kind of a contradiction for me. In private conversations, I don't find myself misaligned with people from any of those constituencies. But in public conversations, we all shout, in our own narrow interests. And that's not helpful. And I think we are in a period of crisis. Yesterday morning I heard Zwelinzima Vavi articulate the crisis in probably the most eloquent way I've ever heard. So the conversation is not happening as it should today. From my own standpoint, I say I've got to make sure that Imperial has the conversation, even if business at large doesn't.
Just back to the business leadership, do you believe that other leaders are prepared to engage to the extent that Imperial is prepared to engage?
I think they are. I know they are. And some of my colleagues in business leadership devote a huge amount of time and effort to trying to be in the right fora, having the right conversations. Sometimes I think we talk past each other though.
Mark, thank you so much for your time. I've been chatting to Mark Lamberti, the CEO of Imperial, and you're watching Captains of Industry here on CNBC Africa.